Hi, thank you for joining me again today. My name is Gary Zacharias. You're listening to the Apologist bookshelf. I really like Natasha Crain. I think she's a good thinker, and now she's putting out some wonderful books. And one of the books that I like a lot is Keeping Your Kids on God's Side, subtitled 40 Conversations to Help Them Build a Lasting Faith. And I've touched on some of them, and in the past, previous podcasts, I want to go to a section called, it's part 4 of her books, called Conversations About the Bible. And I already did one of those that was kind of an introduction about how are the books of the Bible selected. And I wanted to jump off from that. She's got other really interesting topics that she's going to handle. Next one is why were books left out of the Bible? And she said from the podcast we did before that the New Testament books have a really well-documented line of connection to the earliest days and the earliest people of the Christian faith. And so they were eventually put into what was called the canon, the accepted books, because they were known to be directly connected with the apostles and their teachings. But she says, but what about other books? Can they be made connected to the apostles, the early followers? I mean, maybe other books should belong in there. And so she said, there's way too much that could be said and too many writings to talk about all of them. So she said she's going to break it down into 2 broad categories. So one will be books accepted by a few, and then books rejected by all. Okay, so she said we're going to be talking about the New Testament especially here. So her first section is books accepted by a few. She said there are several writings that are not in the canon. They're not among the accepted canonical books of the New Testament. They're not in the canon, but they are widely circulated among Christians. And actually some of the early church fathers saw them as authoritative. She said it's a little hard to come up with the exact number of how many. And so she said around 10. You could say there are about 10 books that were accepted by a few. And she said most of them were writings of the apostolic church fathers. So these men had personal contacts with the apostles. They may have sat under their feet and listened to them, or maybe they lived just after them. And she said we have several of their writings. 1st and 2nd Clement, letters of Ignatius, a letter of Polycarp, the martyrdom of Polycarp, the Didache, Pseudo-Barnabas, shepherd of Hermas, epistle of Diogenes, and the fragments of Papias. And she said these were really valued by early Christians. A few people called them scripture. She said not all of them above were respected to that degree. She says, for example, the Shepherd of Hermas. That was the most popular non-canonical book in the early church. And people like Irenaeus and Origen actually called them inspired. And the church historian Eusebius said it was used for instruction in the faith. Now, despite how popular those books were, and especially the Shepherd of Hermas, it never really gained widespread acceptance as divinely inspired. In fact, one of the early fragments that we have is of people back in the 2nd century said this: it ought to be read, but it cannot be publicly read in the church to the people, either among the prophets, since their number is complete, or among the apostles, to the end of time. And she said there were others that were accepted by a few, but they really weren't part of the writings by the apostolic church fathers. So what do we have in that category? Well, you have the Apocalypse of Peter, Gospel according to the Hebrews, and the Acts of Paul and Thecla. I said those are really a lot less accepted than the writings of the church fathers, but she said she wanted to be thorough, so she's including them here. And then she's got a section here called Books Rejected by All. So she said there's a large number in this category. So she said ones that were accepted by a few, but ultimately rejected. There were a few of those that she just covered, but there are a lot of books that got rejected by everybody. Ones that, for example, were forgeries, some that were written way too late to be associated with the apostles, some that didn't conform to the teaching of books that were known to be authentic. So she said we shouldn't be concerned that people say, oh, some books are missing, but she said we have no reason to believe that these books were connected with the apostles. But she says you ought to get at least to know these because they're connected with a lot of skeptics today. They're called the Gnostic writings. That's Gnostic, Gnostic writings. As she said, that was actually a widespread alternative form of Christianity It was called Gnosticism. It wasn't really a single movement. It was more like a worldview, and it had a lot of different viewpoints. And the idea was that the spirit and the soul were good, not the body. Jesus only appeared to be human. I mean, after all, if physicality is bad, then Jesus wasn't physical. He just looked like a human. And then here's the key part. You have to have special knowledge. And that was available only to the few, and that was the means to salvation. By the way, how many times do we hear that today among different religious groups? It's secret or it's special knowledge, and you only gain it once you kind of come and become part of the group, and then gradually they unfold it little by little, and it gets stranger and stranger as they continue to let you know what's going on. She said it's hard to say how many writings are in that category, but they said generally, Natasha says, something like 30 writings are recognized as Gnostic. And some of the most well-known, and you probably know this one already, you've heard of it, the Gospel of Thomas. That's a biggie. But there's the Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Truth, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of the Egyptians. And she said there really wasn't a single Gnostic church, so you get kind of a variety out there, and so it's really hard to untangle the Gnostic roots. And we get a lot of different opinions on when the Gnostics came along and all. But she says, here's the key idea. Is there any evidence to connect the teachings of these Gnostic writings to Jesus and the apostles? That's the key, isn't it? Can you connect them to Jesus and the apostles? Well, she says to answer the question, let's look at two really important criteria, antiquity and theology. So let's take antiquity. In other words, how old are these? It says most scholars agree that the 27 books we have in our New Testament, they're written well before the end of the first century. There are no Gnostic works that scholars date to the first century, maybe with the exception of the Gospel of Thomas. By the way, I think that's pretty rare. Most historians will talk about the Gospel of Thomas in the mid-2nd century or even later. But she says the Gnostic books that we have were all written much later, 2nd century or beyond. But she said there are 3 scenarios that might account for this silence, the fact that we don't hear from the Gnostics in the 1st century. Maybe they were traced back actually to Jesus, but they were lost. Or maybe they can be traced back to Jesus, but they were suppressed. Or, third choice, Gnostic writings can't be traced back to Jesus because they didn't exist. So she says, let's look at those first 2 scenarios. Is it possible that there were some Gnostic writings, but they just got lost? She says, well, sure. Anything's possible, right? Anything's possible, but what's probable? And she said, right now, these scenarios are mostly arguments from silence. You're just coming up with a, well, maybe kind of thing when there's no evidence at all. So she said, the third scenario is well supported by the evidence. Now, the third scenario, one more time, was that these Gnostic writings are missing because they didn't exist in the 1st century. She said, we don't have any apostolic association for the Gnostic writings we have. And the writings don't even claim the authority of having had their teachings passed down in oral or written form. They're coming up with new revelation and special spiritual knowledge. That's a great contrast, isn't it, with the church fathers? Natasha says the church fathers were being faithful to the original teachings of the apostles who knew Jesus. And she says, in addition, these books have got a negative reaction when they appeared. So if they were so good and leading right back to the apostles, then you'd think the early church fathers would welcome them. Not true. All right, so that's called the criterion of antiquity. In other words, you're looking at these Gnostic writings. Do they go back far enough to be part of the 1st century? No. Here's the second criterion, theology. So she says, the writings already known by the early church fathers were kind of a theological benchmark. In other words, the ones in the 1st century had all passed the inspection of the church fathers, and they said that's exactly what should be taught. That is the correct theology. Well, Gnostic beliefs are really different than the theology taught by the books and the writings connected with the apostles in the New Testament. No wonder the early church fathers rejected them. They actually did more than reject them. They actively wrote against them. And so she quotes a New Testament scholar, a really wonderful person, Dr. Darrell Bock, B-O-C-K, and he says, The rehabilitation of the Gnostics does not mean the re-imaging of Christianity. A comprehensive look at the missing Gospels and the Gnostic teaching does not make them a light for 21st century, despite scholars' recent claims. He says to regard them as such as an anachronism of the worst kind, that does damage to the Christian faith. Says you doing this reimagining and all is a distortion of Gnosticism and a distortion of the Christian faith and a distortion, a distortion of early church history. So these books have come along kind of late in the season and with very different theology. So she says the non-canonical books, they got rejected for good reason. Now they get interested, people get interested in them today. Ooh, maybe Jesus believed this. Oh, maybe Thomas has some insight. But it says the mere existence of these so-called Christian writings that never made it in the Bible, they don't say anything. What matters is, can they legitimately claim spiritual authority because they're connected to Jesus and his apostles? And the answer is no. None of those books have an authoritative connection on par with the writings of the New Testament. All right, she has a second section here. So that was one of hers. And I've got some time. I want to cover another one here. She's talking about how do we know that we can trust the Bible's authors? Yeah, that's a good question. So she says, let's do 4 questions. And she's getting those questions from another person I admire a lot. That's J. Warner Wallace. And she's using information from his book, Cold Case Christianity. And so Wallace assesses the gospel writers. Now remember, he is a cold case detective. So he asks 4 key questions that detectives all over the place will use when they evaluate eyewitnesses. Number 1, were they present? Number 2, were they corroborated? Number 3, were they accurate? Number 4, were they biased? So let's go through these. And we'll go through them fairly quickly, but I think you'll see they're powerful questions. And this is coming from, one more time, a cold case detective. So number 1, you want to check your reliability eyewitnesses. Well, were they present? So it says, who were these authors? Well, it says, according to the early witness of the church fathers, you have Matthew and John. They wrote their eyewitness accounts. Mark was the author of Peter's eyewitness account. And Luke was a physician and historian who used eyewitness testimony, and the Apostle Paul. So there's good reason to believe that the Gospels are written in the 1st century. Now, here we can kind of come up with an early dating, which I think is really powerful. So here it goes. Number 1, the book of Acts. That's a history of the Christian church. Yeah, but listen to the things that Acts doesn't cover. The destruction of the Jewish temple. That was 70 A.D. Nothing in there about the deaths of Peter or Paul or James. So it sounds like, and I think this makes really good sense, Acts had to be written before these events. Now that's about 62, so it's the early 60s. And that's the book of Acts. Now Luke wrote his gospel before Acts. So what does that do? That pushes Luke maybe into the 50s. And the early church agreed that Matthew was even earlier than that. So now, and then Mark's earlier yet. So it said that's probably in the 40s, maybe. So it said that we have good reason to believe the Gospels are based on accounts of people who were eyewitnesses because of when this all is dated. All right, but what about number 2? So the eyewitness was present, but is there any independent evidence that supports their claims? In other words, were they corroborated? That's corroboration. They said there are 2 kinds. So she says there's internal. That's where you look inside the Gospels themselves to see if they support each other. And then there's external corroboration. That's evidence outside the Gospels that may verify. So she starts with internal corroboration. So J. Warner Wallace says, eyewitness accounts, reliable ones, are never completely parallel and identical. They have like different pieces of the same puzzle. And she says that's exactly what we see in the Gospels. In fact, I've done a talk on what's called interlocking Gospels, where you take 2 or 3 gospel accounts of the same event and you put them all together and you say, oh, okay, I got the big picture. So we see that many times. You see 2 or more gospel writers describing the same event and they end up supporting each other's account. So here's an example. In Matthew 8, Jesus goes to the house of Peter's mother-in-law and he heals her. And it says in verse 16 there that people came to Jesus for healing that evening. Well, why would they wait until the evening? Well, look in Mark 1 and Luke 4, and then we find out it was the Sabbath. And of course, you had to wait till evening to travel on the Sabbath. Well, here's another example. We read in Luke 23, Pilate says to Jesus, "Are you king of the Jews?" Jesus says, "Yes, you have said so." And Pilate says, "I find no guilt in this man." Well, wait a minute. Why didn't Pilate charge him even though he claimed to be a king? We have to read John 18 to see there's a longer response that Jesus gave. He said, "Yes, I'm a king, but my kingdom is not of this world." So Pilate doesn't care about that. So that's internal corroboration. What about external? Well, are there details from Jesus' life, other places? He says, yeah. She covers that in one of her chapters here at ancient non-Christian sources that provide those kinds of details. So I don't think I have the time. Well, maybe I can look real quickly here. So Flavius Josephus reports on Jesus, Cornelius Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Thallus, and so we can cover that in another talk sometime. But there are some external corroborations for this. So those are two ways to test the reliability of eyewitnesses. Here's the third way. Were they accurate? You got to have accuracy. In other words, watching something and then not being accurate, that's not going to work. So she says, just because they were there and just because it was corroborated, how do we know that it's accurately preserved? She says it's so important. She's going to cover that in her next chapter. So if that's okay, we're going to hold off on that one. How about number 4? Were they biased? So it says many people believe you can't trust the Gospels because those writers were Christians, and they're trying to convince others. Now, that's bias, skeptics say, right? It's a predisposition towards something or someone. So that makes the Gospels unreliable. Well, she says, wait a minute. There's a critical difference between bias prior to an experience and conviction after an experience. So she said, think about how the disciples treated Jesus during his life. They seemed pretty confused, didn't they? Well, no wonder. They were expecting a Messiah that would do what? He would come charging over the horizon and knock the Romans out of the way, and the people would be saved from Roman oppression. Hurrah, hurrah. And then what do they see? They see this meek Jesus going to his death like a criminal and raised back to life as a spiritual Savior. So they became convinced of Jesus' deity only after they experienced his resurrection. So, was there just simple bias? No. But what about maybe another kind of bias, which is an issue of motive? Was there something they were hoping to gain from saying what they did? That would be a bias. Well, Jim Wallace, J. Warner Wallace, says in his experience as a cop, there are just 3 motives that drive dishonesty. I bet you can think of them. One is greed, right? Money. Second is sexual or relational desires. And third is the pursuit of power. So she says, well, let's see. Would that account for the disciples' beliefs and actions? How about financial greed? How'd that turn out? Well, they worked really hard. I mean, Paul says to the Corinthians, to this present hour, we hunger and thirst. We're poorly dressed. We're buffeted. We're homeless. That's 1 Corinthians 4. In 2 Corinthians 6, Paul says he had nothing. In Acts 3, Peter says to a lame man, I have no silver or gold, but what I do have I give to you. There's no hint that they were driven by greed. I mean, think about that. Did any of them get anything big and important? Something of value? No. How about sexual or relational desire? Now, we don't know much about the families of the apostles, but we know that Peter was married. That's Matthew 8. Paul suggested in 1 Corinthians 9 that some of the other apostles were too. So they weren't a bunch of single guys who were seeking some kind of relationship from their message. How about power? Maybe they were seeking power. Well, yeah, some Christians did rise to significant power. That was centuries after Jesus lived, though. What about the earliest Christians? How did they do with power? Oh, no, they were persecuted. They were martyred. There's no record of any apostle ever changing his testimony to avoid death. She says we don't have any evidence they benefited at all. So it couldn't have been bias or a motive that was responsible for their testimony. And then she ends her section here. She said, we'd love to see things for ourselves before we believe in them, but in the case of historical claims, you can't do that. You have to assess the word of others and determine if there's enough evidence to see and conclude that their claims are reliable. And she says, there is good reason to believe the Gospels are based on reliable eyewitness testimony. The people were there. The accounts are corroborated. What they said has been accurately preserved. And there's no reason to believe that bias or some kind of motive was responsible for their claims. So I think what I'll do is I'll wait for another podcast on this book, but I do want to cover how do we know the Bible we have today says what the authors originally wrote in. So we'll cover that next time. Well, maybe not next time. I might pick a different book. But anyway, so there's plenty more to do in her book. It's a rich book, something that would be so good. And by the way, it says keeping your kids on God's side. If you don't have any kids, it's a great book. Yeah, you would get a lot out of it if you did have kids, but don't let that title scare you off and think, well, this is just for kids. No, it's not. Anybody can get a lot of good material out of this. Everything Natasha writes is great, and look at her podcast sometime.